Rescuers find a stray dog sheltering a wounded cat during a storm. What happens next will restore your faith and friendship. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. In a small town nestled in America's heartland, where paved streets give way to gravel roads and everyone knows their neighbors, an unexpected friendship was about to emerge from the chaos of a violent storm. The rain poured relentlessly, transforming quiet streets into rushing streams. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the deserted downtown area where a stray dog named Max searched desperately for shelter. Max wasn't just any stray. His matted fur, a mix of brown and gray, told the story of countless nights spent searching for food and warmth. He had learned to survive on his own, navigating the streets with a wariness that came from experience. But tonight's storm was different. Its ferocity made even the most hardened street dogs seek refuge. The town's usually busy main street had emptied hours ago as the storm warnings blared from emergency vehicles. Shop owners had hurriedly locked up, leaving behind darkened storefronts and empty sidewalks. The wind howled through the narrow spaces between buildings, carrying debris and fallen leaves in its violent dance. Max's journey through the storm wasn't random. He moved with purpose, testing each potential shelter only to find them either too exposed or already claimed by other animals seeking refuge. His paws splashed through puddles that grew deeper by the minute. His usually alert ears pressed flat against his head in response to the thunder that seemed to shake the very ground. A particularly bright flash of lightning drove Max into a narrow alley between the old hardware store and what used to be the town's first bank. The space was tight, barely wide enough for him to turn around, but it offered some protection from the driving rain. Water streamed down the brick walls on either side, creating small waterfalls that trapped him in this temporary sanctuary. The alley was dark, lit only by the occasional flash of lightning that cast strange shadows against the walls. Max's keen eyes adjusted to the darkness, scanning his surroundings with the instinct of a survivor. The thunder that followed was deafening, echoing off the walls and causing Max to press himself closer to the ground, his body trembling despite his attempts to remain calm. It was during one of these lightning flashes that Max noticed movement under a nearby awning. His ears perked forward, and his nose worked to catch a scent through the rain-washed air. Something, or someone, was hiding there, and despite his own fear, Max's curiosity began to overcome his caution. The awning jutted out from the building's side, creating a small space that seemed to promise better shelter than his current position. Max hesitated, weighing his options. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and his current spot offered minimal protection from the wind that now whipped rain sideways into his hiding place. Another flash of lightning revealed more details of the shape under the awning. It was smaller than him, and something about its movement seemed wrong, pained perhaps, or injured. Max's ears twitched forward as he caught a sound different from the storm's chaos, a soft whimper that spoke of pain and fear. Despite years of learning to avoid other animals, something about this situation pulled at Max. The sound came again, barely audible over the storm, but unmistakably a cry for help. His protective instincts, buried under layers of survival mechanisms, began to surface. Max took a tentative step forward, then another. The rain pelted his back as he left his minimal shelter, but he continued moving toward the awning. As he drew closer, he could make out more details, a small, wet bundle of fur, trembling violently. A cat, he realized, its gray fur matted against its bee. Odie, one paw held at an awkward angle that spoke of injury. The cat, which he would soon know as Whiskers, noticed his approach and tried to press itself further into the corner. But there was nowhere else to go. Max could see the fear in its eyes, wide and reflecting the occasional lightning flashes. He recognized that fear. It was the same fear he had lived with for so long. Instead of advancing further, Max stopped. He stood in the rain, letting the water soak through his fur, and waited. His posture softened, his tail lowering to show he meant no harm. In this moment, Max made a choice that would change not only his life but the life of the injured cat before him. Despite every instinct telling him to look out only for himself, he chose to stay. The rain continued its assault on the small town as Max made his decision. Standing between the injured cat and the full force of the storm, his body created a makeshift barrier against the wind and rain. Water streamed off his fur in rivulets, but he remained steady, becoming a living shield for the smaller animal. Whiskers watched Max's every movement with the intensity that only a cornered, injured animal could muster. His green eyes, wide with fear, tracked each slight shift in Max's position. The cat's gray fur was plastered to his body, making him appear even smaller than he was. His injured paw, held close to his chest, had begun to swell noticeably. The space under the awning was tight, barely large enough for both of them, but Max managed to position himself so that most of the wind-driven rain couldn't reach Whiskers. The metal above them rattled with each gust, creating a chaotic rhythm that matched the storm's intensity. Water pooled around their feet, but at least here, under the awning's protection, it wasn't actively pouring on them. Minutes passed in this tense standoff. Max could sense Whiskers' confusion at his behavior. Most dogs would have either attacked or moved on by now, but Max remained steadfast in his self-appointed role as protector. His own experiences as a stray had taught him the value of unexpected kindness, though he'd rarely been on the receiving end of it. A particularly loud crack of thunder made Whiskers flinch, aggravating his injured paw. The cat let out a small whimper of pain, and something in that sound broke through the last of Max's hesitation. Moving slowly, telegraphing each movement to avoid startling the injured cat, Max lowered his head toward Whiskers' paw. Whiskers hissed weakly, more from fear than aggression. His entire body tensed, expecting an attack, but he was too weak and too trapped to do anything about it. What happened next surprised him completely. Instead of attacking, Max began to gently lick the injured paw, his tongue carefully cleaning away the dirt and grime that had accumulated around the wound. The gesture was so unexpected that Whiskers forgot to be afraid for a moment. The gentle ministrations provided the first relief he'd felt since injuring himself while fleeing from the storm. Max's attention to the wound was careful, almost methodical, showing an intelligence and gentleness that contradicted every story Whiskers had ever heard about dogs. As Max continued his careful cleaning of the wound, the tension in Whiskers' body gradually began to ease. The cat's breathing, which had been rapid and shallow with fear, slowly steadied. Though still wary, Whiskers allowed himself to accept this unexpected care from an equally unexpected source. The storm raged on around them, but in their small shelter, something remarkable was happening. The natural order of things, the assumed enmity between cat and dog, was being quietly challenged. Max's gentle care spoke of something deeper than mere animal instinct. It spoke of compassion, of understanding what it meant to be hurt and alone. Time seemed to slow in their small sanctuary. The rhythmic sound of the rain, combined with Max's gentle attention, created a strange bleat of calm in the midst of the storm. Whiskers found himself relaxing further, his fear gradually being replaced by cautious acceptance. Each gentle touch from Max helped bridge the gap between them, building a fragile trust that defied their natural instincts. Max's behavior wasn't entirely altruistic. In caring for Whiskers, he found a purpose that had been missing from his life as a stray. Each small sign of trust from the cat provided a warmth that had nothing to do with physical temperature. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Max felt needed. The wind continued to howl around the corners of their shelter, but its threats seemed less important now. Whiskers had stopped trembling, though whether from fear or cold was hard to tell. His eyes, still fixed on Max, had lost their initial panic. In its place was something new, a cautious curiosity about this strange dog who had chosen to help rather than harm. As the night wore on, their unusual partnership continued to evolve. Max would occasionally pause in his attention to Whiskers' paw to shake the water from his fur, always careful to avoid spraying the injured cat. Each time he returned to his self-appointed task, Whiskers accepted his presence a little more readily, the space between them charged with growing understanding rather than fear. In the darkness of that stormy night, surrounded by the chaos of the elements, two unlikely companions found something neither had expected: the beginning of a connection that transcended their natural instincts. Though neither could know it yet, this chance encounter would change both their lives in ways they couldn't imagine. The storm's intensity had begun to wane, though rain still fell steadily from the dark sky. In their small shelter beneath the awning, Max and Whiskers had reached a delicate understanding. The initial fear and tension had given way to something more complex, a wordless communication that grew stronger with each passing hour. Max sat alert but relaxed, his tail moving in slow, gentle sweeps across the wet ground. This simple gesture, a universal sign of canine friendliness, spoke volumes in the darkness. His eyes, warm and patient, remained fixed on Whiskers, watching for any signs of distress or discomfort. The dog's presence had become less that of a guard and more that of a companion, though he remained protective of their small space. Whiskers, for his part, had begun to show subtle signs of acceptance. His body language, previously rigid with fear, had softened. The injured cat had shifted his position slightly, turning his body toward Max rather than away, a small change that spoke volumes about the trust developing between them. His injured paw still throbbed, but the pain seemed more manageable in the presence of his unexpected protector. In the darkness, their communication took on its own rhythm. When Max would shift his weight, Whiskers would tense briefly, then relax as he remembered this large creature meant him no harm. When Whiskers would wince from his injury, Max would inch closer, offering warmth and comfort without overwhelming the smaller animal. Their dance of adjustment and response played out in tiny movements, each one building upon the last. The silence between them was filled with meaning. Max's occasional soft whines were met with Whiskers' subtle ear movements. When thunder rumbled in the distance, Max would move slightly closer, creating a more effective barrier against the elements. Whiskers, rather than shrinking away, began to accept these movements as part of their new normal. Their breathing had synchronized without either of them realizing it. In the confined space, this shared rhythm created a sense of unity that transcended their natural differences. Max's steady presence acted as an anchor for Whiskers, who found himself drawing strength from the dog's calm demeanor. As the hours wore on, Whiskers made a decision that surprised them both. Moving carefully to avoid putting pressure on his injured paw, he began to edge closer to Max. The movement was slow, deliberate, each small shift forward a testament to the trust that had grown between them. Max remained perfectly still during this approach, understanding instinctively that any sudden movement might break this precious moment. The distance between them gradually disappeared. Whiskers, driven by a combination of cold, pain, and a growing sense of security, finally closed the gap. His small body pressed against Max's larger one, seeking warmth and comfort. The contact was tentative at first, but as Max remained steady and gentle, Whiskers allowed himself to relax fully into the warmth of his fur. Max's response to this trust was subtle but significant. He carefully adjusted his position to better shelter the cat, creating a warm pocket of space protected from the wind and rain. His body curved slightly, forming a protective C shape around Whiskers without trapping him. This position allowed the cat to leave if he chose while offering maximum protection from the elements. The storm sounds had become a distant backdrop to their shared silence. Water continued to pool around them, but in their small bubble of warmth, it seemed less threatening. Max's fur, though damp, provided surprising comfort to Whiskers, who found himself drifting between wakefulness and sleep. As Max watched over his new companion, his own thoughts turned to the many nights he had spent alone on these streets. The life of a stray was solitary by nature, filled with constant vigilance and the endless search for food and shelter. But here, in this moment, he felt a different kind of purpose. The weight of Whiskers against his side gave him something he hadn't realized he was missing: a connection. Whiskers, too, was experiencing something new. As a cat who had likely known human care at some point, his time on the streets had been especially difficult. The injury that had left him vulnerable in this storm might have been his end, if not for Max's intervention. Now, pressed against the warm fur of a dog, a creature he had been taught to fear, he found an unexpected sense of safety. Their unlikely alliance, formed in the crucible of the storm, had evolved into something neither of them fully understood, but both desperately needed. As the night deepened around them, they remained together, two strays finding in each other the companionship they had both been missing. The first hints of dawn began to creep into the sky, turning the black of night into a murky gray. The storm had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind puddles that reflected the gradually lightening sky. The air was heavy with moisture, and the only sounds were the steady drip of water from saturated awnings and the occasional distant rumble of thunder. Max and Whiskers remained in their shelter, their unlikely partnership having survived the night. The first indication that their world was about to change came in the form of distant voices and the beam of flashlights cutting through the remaining darkness. The town's emergency response team had begun their post-storm assessment, checking for damage and anyone who might need assistance. The approaching lights caused both animals to tense. Max's ears perked forward, his body straightening slightly, but maintaining his protective position around Whiskers. The cat, still pressed against Max's side, opened his eyes but made no attempt to move. His injury, combined with exhaustion, had left him too weak to consider flight. The rescue team's voices grew clearer as they moved methodically down the street. Their flashlight beams swept across buildings and into alleys, accompanied by the splash of boots through puddles. "Check that alley," a female voice called out. "There might be someone seeking shelter there." Max's muscles tensed as the lights swung in their direction. Years of avoiding human contact had taught him to be wary, but his newfound responsibility to Whiskers complicated his usual response to flee. The cat seemed to sense his dilemma, pressing closer against him in a gesture that seemed both seeking and offering comfort. The first flashlight beam found them, illuminating their small sanctuary under the awning. "Over here," called one of the rescuers. "We've got animals." The light held steady on them, soon joined by others as more members of the team approached. Max's instincts warred within him. Part of him urged flight, while another part recognized that Whiskers needed help he couldn't provide. His solution was to remain where he was, positioning himself more firmly between the approaching humans and the injured cat. A low growl rumbled in his throat, not aggressive, but clearly protective. The rescue team, experienced in handling animals in distress, approached cautiously. They formed a loose semicircle around the awning, careful to leave space and not make the animals feel trapped. Their lights illuminated the scene fully now. A large, dirty dog protecting a clearly injured cat, an unlikely image that caused several of them to exchange surprised looks. "Easy there, big guy," came a gentle voice. Sarah, a veteran animal rescue worker, stepped slightly forward from the group. Her movements were slow and deliberate, her voice maintained at a soothing pitch. "We're here to help. Both of you." Max's growl subsided slightly at her tone, though he remained alert and protective. His tail, usually a good indicator of a dog's mood, remained low but gave a slight wag, showing uncertainty rather than aggression. Sarah noticed this subtle signal and adjusted her approach accordingly. "Look at that," she murmured to her colleagues. "He's protecting the cat. I've never seen anything like it." Her words carried admiration and a touch of wonder. In her years of rescue work, she'd seen many surprising things, but this level of cross-species protection was extraordinary. Max watched as Sarah slowly knelt, making herself less threatening. She kept her movements smooth and predictable, speaking softly the entire time. "What a good boy you are," she continued, her voice carrying genuine warmth. "Taking care of your friend like this. We want to help both of you." The other team members maintained their positions, creating a safe perimeter while letting Sarah work. They could see that this was a delicate situation. One wrong move could spook either animal and make rescue impossible. The morning light continued to strengthen, revealing more details of the scene. The matted condition of Max's fur, the obvious swelling in Whiskers' paw, the way the two animals remained pressed together despite the presence of humans. Sarah's patience began to show results. Max's growl had completely subsided, though he remained watchful. His eyes moved between Sarah and Whiskers, as if trying to communicate that the cat was the one who needed help. His protective stance never wavered, but the tension in his body began to ease slightly. The scene held in perfect balance, the rescue team maintaining their careful distance, Sarah in her crouched position, and the two animals in their shelter. In this moment, as dawn fully broke over the town, the future of both Max and Whiskers hung in delicate suspension, waiting to see whether trust or fear would prevail. Sarah remained crouched at a safe distance, her experienced eyes taking in every detail of the scene before her. In her 15 years of animal rescue, she had learned to read the subtle signs that could make the difference between a successful rescue and a failed attempt. What she saw here was remarkable. A stray dog who had not only overcome his natural instincts, but had appointed himself protector of an injured cat. The rest of the rescue team maintained their positions, creating a loose semicircle around the scene. Their radio chatter had been silenced, understanding the delicacy of the situation. The morning light now fully illuminated the alley, revealing the true state of both animals. Max's fur, though matted and dirty, couldn't hide his strong, healthy frame. Whiskers, however, was clearly in need of immediate medical attention. "We need to move quickly," Sarah whispered to her colleague Mike, who stood ready with a transport carrier. "That cat's injury looks serious, and they're both exhausted." Her mind was already running through various scenarios, each with its own risks and possibilities. The standard procedure would be to separate the animals, but something told her that would be a mistake. Max watched their every movement, his body still curved protectively around Whiskers. The cat had begun to show signs of increased distress, his breathing becoming more labored, likely from pain and exhaustion. This change in Whiskers' condition didn't go unnoticed by either Max or Sarah. The dog's ears flicked back and forth between the humans and his friend, his anxiety visible in every muscle. Sarah made her decision. "We're taking them both," she announced to her team, her voice firm but quiet. Together, this declaration was met with surprised looks from her colleagues. It went against standard protocol, which dictated separate handling and quarantine for strays, especially of different species. "Sarah," Mike began, concern evident in his voice. "The protocols, look at them," Sarah interrupted, gesturing toward the pair. "That dog hasn't left the cat's side all night during the storm. He's protecting him, not threatening him. If we separate them now, we risk traumatizing both animals and losing their trust completely." As if to emphasize her point, Max shifted slightly, adjusting his position to better support Whiskers, who had let out a small whimper of pain. The tenderness in this simple action was unmistakable. The rescue team watched in amazement as the dog gently nuzzled the cat, offering comfort in a way that seemed almost human in its understanding. Sarah began the delicate process of approaching them again, this time with a new strategy. Instead of trying to separate them, she spoke softly to Max, acknowledging his role as protector. "You've done such a good job taking care of your friend," she murmured, inching closer. "Now let us help you both." Together, Max's eyes never left Sarah, but his posture began to relax slightly. Something in her voice, or perhaps in her words, seemed to reach him. Whiskers, too, showed signs of understanding that help had arrived. The cat's eyes, though glazed with pain, tracked Sarah's movements with less fear than before. The team watched in tense silence as Sarah slowly closed the distance. She held out her hand, palm up, letting Max catch her scent. The dog's nose twitched, taking in the information about this human who promised help without separation. After what seemed like an eternity, Max's tail gave a slight wag. This was the moment Sarah had been waiting for. With slow, careful movements, she reached in her pocket and withdrew a small treat. "This is for being such a brave boy," she said, placing it near Max. But instead of taking it immediately, Max looked at Whiskers, then back at Sarah, as if asking about his friend's care first. The gesture wasn't lost on Sarah or her team. This wasn't just a random act of animal kindness they were witnessing. This was a bond that defied explanation. Sarah's decision to keep them together was no longer just an instinct. It had become a necessity. These two had found something in each other that went beyond mere companionship. They had become each other's lifeline. "I promise," Sarah said, her voice catching slightly with emotion. "We're going to take care of both of you. Together." The words seemed to carry weight in the morning air, a contract between species that transcended normal boundaries. For in that moment, as the sun continued to rise over their small town, Sarah understood that she wasn't just rescuing two stray animals. She was preserving something far more precious, a friendship that had bloomed in the midst of adversity. The rescue vehicle's interior was warm and dry, a stark contrast to the wet alley where Max and Whiskers had spent the night. Sarah had managed to convince her team to modify their standard transport protocols, setting up a single large carrier that could accommodate both animals. The unusual arrangement reflected the unusual nature of the situation they found themselves in. Max sat alert in the carrier, his body providing a steady support for Whiskers, who had been carefully positioned beside him. The cat's injured paw had been temporarily stabilized with a light bandage, but every bump in the road caused him to wince. Each time this happened, Max would shift slightly, adjusting his position to better cushion his friend from the vehicle's movement. Sarah drove carefully, avoiding potholes and taking turns slowly. In the rearview mirror, she could see the pair in their carrier, illuminated by the early morning light filtering through the windows. The scene behind her challenged everything she thought she knew about animal behavior. Through 15 years of rescue work, she'd never witnessed such devotion between different species. "Central, this is Unit 7, she spoke in her radio, keeping her voice low to avoid startling the animals. "We're en route to Dr. Martinez's clinic with 2 rescues. 1 cat, male, injured paw, possible severe sprain or break. 1 dog, male, appears healthy but stressed. Request priority intake." She paused before adding, "Note for intake. These 2 need to stay together. I'll explain when we arrive." The response came quickly. "Copy that, Unit 7. Dr. Martinez has been notified and is preparing for your arrival." In the carrier, Whiskers had begun to tremble slightly. Whether from pain or fear of the unknown situation was unclear. Max responded immediately, gently pressing closer and offering a soft whine that seemed meant to comfort. The cat gradually settled against him, their familiar connection providing stability in this unfamiliar situation. Sarah watched this interaction through the mirror and felt her throat tighten with emotion. She'd seen countless animals form bonds over the years, but this was different. These 2 had found each other in the midst of a crisis and formed a connection that transcended their natural instincts. It was as if they understood something about friendship that humans sometimes struggled to grasp. "You're going to be famous at the shelter, you too," she said softly, navigating through the quiet morning streets. "Nobody's going to believe this story until they see it with their own eyes." Max's ears perked up at her voice, though his attention remained primarily on Whiskers. The drive to the veterinary clinic took them through neighborhoods still bearing evidence of the night's storm. Tree branches littered the streets, and emergency crews were already at work clearing debris. Sarah's mind wandered to the circumstances that had brought these 2 together. What were the odds that a storm would drive them to the same shelter? What made Max decide to protect rather than chase? A particularly rough patch of road caused the vehicle to jolt slightly. Whiskers let out a small cry of pain, and Max's reaction was immediate. He shifted his body to create a better barrier between the cat and the carrier's wall, while making a soft rumbling sound that seemed intended to soothe. Sarah quickly adjusted her driving, moving even more carefully. "Almost there, guys," she assured them, turning onto the street leading to the clinic. "Dr. Martinez is the best vet in town. She'll know exactly what to do." Her words were meant to comfort herself as much as her passengers. She knew that the next few hours would be crucial, not just for Whiskers' physical recovery, but for maintaining the extraordinary bond she was witnessing. As they pulled into the clinic's parking lot, Sarah could see Dr. Martinez waiting at the end. "Rance." The veterinarian's early arrival spoke to her understanding of the situation's urgency. Sarah parked as close to the entrance as possible, then turned to face her unusual passengers. Max was already watching her, his dark eyes showing an intelligence that seemed to understand they had arrived somewhere important. Whiskers had dozed off against him, the exhaustion of the night finally taking its toll. The sight of them together, the large, protective dog and the small, injured cat, reinforced Sarah's conviction that keeping them together was the right decision. "We're here," she announced softly, reaching for her keys. "And I promise you both, this is just the beginning of your story, not the end." As she stepped out of the vehicle to meet Dr. Martinez, Sarah knew she was about to challenge some long-standing protocols about animal care and rescue. But watching Max gently wake Whiskers with a soft nudge, she also knew that some bonds were worth fighting for. Dr. Martinez's examination room was bright and sterile, a sharp contrast to the dark alley where Max and Whiskers had found each other. The fluorescent lights illuminated every detail of their condition. Max's matted fur showed signs of long-term neglect, while Whiskers' injury appeared more serious under proper lighting. "This is remarkable," Dr. Martinez murmured, observing how Max remained perfectly still beside the examination table where Whiskers lay. The dog's eyes never left the cat, tracking every movement the veterinarian made. When she reached for Whiskers' injured paw, Max's muscles tensed, but he didn't growl or interfere. It was as if he understood she was trying to help. The examination revealed the extent of Whiskers' injury. "The paw is definitely broken," Dr. Martinez explained to Sarah, keeping her voice calm and professional despite the unusual situation. "There's significant swelling, and I'm concerned about possible infection. We'll need to take x-rays to assess the full damage." When the time came to separate them for the x-rays, Max's distress became evident. His tail dropped, and a low whine escaped his throat as they tried to lead him to the waiting area. Whiskers, too, became agitated, trying to maintain visual contact with his protector despite the pain he was clearly in. Sarah stepped in, her experience with traumatized animals guiding her actions. "Let him stay," she suggested. "He's remained calm so far, and separating them might cause unnecessary stress." After a moment's consideration, Dr. Martinez agreed, though this decision would require them to take additional precautions during the x-ray process. Throughout the imaging procedure, Max remained in the corner of the room, watching intently but staying out of the way. His behavior continued to amaze both Sarah and Dr. Martinez. This wasn't just an animal acting on instinct, but displaying a level of understanding that challenged their expectations. "I've never seen anything quite like this," Dr. Martinez admitted as she examined the x-rays. "The break is clean, fortunately, but what's truly extraordinary is the way these two interact. That dog seems to understand exactly what's happening." She paused, studying the images more closely. "We'll need to perform surgery to set the bone properly." The word surgery caused a ripple of tension in the room. Max's ears perked up at the change in Dr. Martinez's tone, and he moved closer to the examination table, his concern palpable. Sarah watched as Whiskers reached out with his good paw, touching Max's nose in what seemed like a gesture of reassurance. "The surgery needs to happen soon," Dr. Martinez continued. "But first, I want to examine Max as well. We need to ensure he's healthy, especially if we're keeping them together during recovery." The examination of Max proved easier than expected. He remained cooperative as long as he could maintain visual contact with Whiskers. Sarah stayed close during the entire process, her presence providing additional comfort to both animals. She found herself talking to them softly, explaining each step of the examination, each test, each decision. Whether they understood her words or not, her calm voice seemed to help maintain the peaceful atmosphere. As Dr. Martinez listened to Max's heart and checked his overall condition, she shared her findings with Sarah. Despite his appearance, he's actually in remarkably good health. Strong heart, clear lungs, good teeth. He's been surviving well on the streets, but he's definitely not feral. This dog has had a home before. The implication of those words hung in the air. Max had once belonged somewhere, to someone. His gentle nature and understanding of human interactions suggested training and socialization. Somewhere out there, someone might be missing him. "We'll scan for a microchip after the surgery," Dr. Martinez decided, making notes in her file. "For now, our priority is Whiskers' operation." The support team will prep him for surgery within the hour. She turned to Sarah, her expression serious. We'll need to keep Max somewhat separated during the actual procedure, but I suggest having him nearby in recovery. Their bond might actually aid in the healing process. Sarah nodded, already formulating a plan. She would stay with Max during the surgery, helping him understand that his friend wasn't being taken away permanently. Her years of experience told her that the next few hours would be crucial, not just for Whisker's physical recovery, but for maintaining the trust that had been built. As the medical team began their preparations, Sarah knelt beside Max, who had returned to his position near Whiskers. "You've done an amazing job protecting him," she said softly, "and now it's our turn to help. I promise you'll see him again soon." Max's eyes met hers, and in that moment, Sarah felt he truly understood. This wasn't just about treating an injured animal anymore. It was about preserving something extraordinary that had emerged from a stormy night. The shelter's main room buzzed with the usual morning activity: dogs barking in their kennels, cats watching from their perches, and staff members going about their daily routines. But today was different. Word had spread quickly about the unusual pair being transferred from Dr. Martinez's clinic, and everyone was curious to see the dog who had appointed himself protector of an injured cat. Sarah had arranged a special space for them, a quiet corner of the shelter's recovery ward, modified to accommodate both animals together. It wasn't standard procedure, but nothing about this situation was standard. The area had been set up with a large, comfortable bed, water bowls, and enough space for both Max and Whiskers to move around comfortably while the cat recovered from surgery. Whiskers, still groggy from anesthesia, rested in a soft bed, his newly bandaged paw carefully positioned. The surgery had been successful, but recovery would take time. Max padded quietly around the space, investigating every corner, every sound, but always circling back to check on his friend. His protective instincts hadn't diminished despite being in a safe environment. "Let me introduce you to some of our other residents," said Tom, one of the shelter's longtime staff members, as he approached their enclosure. He led a small group of dogs past their space, maintaining a respectful distance. Max watched attentively, but showed no signs of aggression or fear. His focus remained primarily on Whiskers, only briefly acknowledging the other animals. The other dogs' reactions varied from curiosity to confusion. They could smell both cat and dog scents coming from the space, but the usual territorial behaviors were absent. Max's calm demeanor and clear protective stance created an atmosphere that even the more excitable dogs seemed to respect. "It's extraordinary," Tom remarked to Sarah, watching as Max gently adjusted the blanket near Whiskers with his nose. He's not just tolerating the cat's presence, he's actively caring for him. I've never seen anything like it in 20 years of shelter work." Sarah nodded, remembering the storm-swept alley where she'd first found them. "It's changing how we think about potential adoptions too," she replied. "Maybe we need to be more open-minded about which animals can live together harmoniously." Throughout the day, various staff members attempted to engage Max in typical shelter activities: walks, playtime, socialization with other dogs. But each time, Max would become anxious if led too far from Whiskers. His dedication was unwavering, even in this new, safe environment. One particularly touching moment occurred when a young shelter volunteer approached with food bowls. As she placed them in the enclosure, Max waited until Whiskers had started eating before touching his own food. The volunteer stood transfixed, watching this display of selflessness that seemed more human than animal. "He's teaching us something," the volunteer whispered to Sarah. "About loyalty, about putting others first." Sarah couldn't help but agree. Max's behavior was challenging their preconceptions about animal relationships and capabilities for empathy. The afternoon brought more visitors, potential adopters walking through the shelter, staff members from other departments, even a local veterinarian who had heard about the unusual pair. Each time someone new approached, Max would position himself slightly between them and Whiskers, not aggressively, but protectively. It was as if he was evaluating each person's intentions. Whiskers, for his part, seemed to draw confidence from Max's presence. Despite being in a strange place, surrounded by unfamiliar sounds and smells, the cat remained calm. When he was awake, His eyes would often seek out Max, and the sight of his protector would visibly relax him. As evening approached, Sarah observed them through the observation window. The day's activities had died down, and the shelter was quieting. Max had settled himself next to Whisker's bed, close enough to provide comfort, but careful not to disturb the healing paw. The cat had dozed off, his breathing steady and peaceful. "You know," Tom said, joining her at the window, "we keep trying to socialize them with other animals, but maybe that's not what they need right now. Maybe they're exactly where they need to be, with each other." Sarah watched as Max lifted his head, checking on Whiskers one more time before laying down for the night. The bond between them had not only survived the transition to the shelter, but seemed to have grown stronger. In this controlled environment, with proper care and attention, their connection was flourishing. What they had stumbled upon in that stormy alley was proving to be more than just a temporary alliance. It was a reminder that sometimes the most profound relationships come in the most unexpected packages, and that love and loyalty know no species boundaries. As the shelter settled in for the night, Max and Whiskers had become more than just residents. They had become teachers, showing everyone who encountered them what true friendship looked like. Days at the shelter had fallen into a comfortable routine for Max and Whiskers. The morning sun would filter through the windows, casting warm patches of light across their shared space. Staff members had grown accustomed to their unique arrangement, and the pair had become something of a shelter mascot, drawing visitors who had heard about their remarkable story. But on this particular morning, Sarah noticed something was different. She had arrived early, as usual, to check on her special charges before the day's activities began. Max was already awake, his posture more alert than usual, his eyes fixed on Whiskers with an intensity that caught her attention. Whiskers lay in his bed, but something about his position seemed off. The cat's breathing appeared slightly labored, and he didn't touch his breakfast, unusual for him, as he'd been eating well since the surgery. Most telling was Max's behavior. The dog kept nudging his friend gently, whining softly in a way Sarah had never heard before. "What's wrong, buddy?" Sarah asked softly, entering their space. Max looked up at her, then back at Whiskers, his concern palpable. As she approached, she could see that Whiskers' surgical site looked different. There was swelling that hadn't been there the day before, and the cat's temperature felt elevated to her touch. Sarah's heart rate quickened as she conducted a closer examination. The cat's injured paw was warmer than it should be, and there was redness extending beyond the surgical site. Her years of experience told her these were potential signs of infection, a serious complication for any surgery, but especially concerning given Whiskers' small size and recent trauma. "I need Dr. Martinez here now," she spoke into her radio, keeping her voice calm despite her growing worry. Max hadn't moved from his position next to Whiskers, but his eyes followed her every movement. There was an understanding in his gaze that seemed almost human. He knew something was wrong with his friend. The shelter's morning routine continued around them, but in their corner, time seemed to stand still. Other staff members peeked in, concerned by the unusual radio call so early in the morning. They saw Max standing guard, more vigilant than ever, while Whiskers dozed fitfully in his bed. Dr. Martinez arrived within the hour, medical bag in hand. As she entered the space, Max's behavior confirmed everyone's concerns. Instead of his usual subtle protective stance, he actively moved aside, as if understanding that the veterinarian needed full access to help his friend. His eyes never left Whiskers, but he made no attempt to interfere with the examination. "The infection is aggressive," Dr. Martinez confirmed after examining Whiskers thoroughly. "We need to start him on strong antibiotics immediately, and he may need additional surgery to clean the infection site." She paused, watching Max's reaction to her words. The dog's ears had perked up at her serious tone, and he'd moved closer to Whiskers, offering silent support. Sarah felt her throat tighten. They had all thought Whiskers was on the road to recovery. The cat had been making steady progress, becoming more active each day, his personality emerging as he felt safer in his new environment. Now this setback threatened not just his recovery, but potentially his life. "We'll need to take him to the clinic," Dr. Martinez continued, her voice gentle but firm. The infection is serious enough to require round-the-clock monitoring. The implications of those words hung heavy in the air. Taking Whiskers to the clinic would mean separating him from Max for the first time since their rescue. Max seemed to sense the gravity of the situation. His whining had stopped, replaced by an almost eerie silence. He stood perfectly still, pressing himself against Whiskers' bed, his presence both protective and comforting. The cat, despite his weakness, managed to lift his head slightly, touching his nose to Max's fur. Sarah watched this interaction with a heavy heart. The bond between these two animals had grown stronger with each passing day. They had overcome their natural instincts, the trauma of the storm, and the challenges of adaptation to shelter life. Now they faced their biggest test yet, separation. The staff began preparing for Whiskers' transport to the clinic. As they gathered the necessary equipment and paperwork, Sarah knelt beside Max. "He needs special care right now," she explained softly, knowing that even if he couldn't understand her words, he would understand her tone. "We'll bring him back to you, I promise." Max's response was unexpected. Instead of becoming agitated at the preparations to move Whiskers, he remained calm, almost resolute. It was as if he understood that separation was necessary for his friend's survival. His behavior continued to amaze everyone present. This wasn't just animal instinct at work, but something deeper, something that spoke of true understanding and selfless love. As they prepared to move Whiskers to the transport carrier, Max did something that brought tears to several staff members' eyes. He gently licked his friend's face, a gesture of such tender care that it seemed to transcend species barriers. Then he stepped back, allowing the medical team to do their work, though his eyes never left his friend. The surgery waiting area at the veterinary clinic had never felt so tense. Max sat perfectly still beside Sarah, his eyes fixed on the doors leading to the operating room, where Whiskers was undergoing his second surgery. The staff had made an exception to allow Max's presence, understanding that keeping him away would only cause more stress for both animals. Hour after hour passed, marked only by the quiet ticking of the wall clock and the occasional movement of medical staff through the corridor. Max hadn't moved from his spot, hadn't accepted food or water, his entire being focused on those doors and what lay beyond them. Sarah remained by his side, offering quiet comfort and wondering at the depth of devotion she was witnessing. "He's stable," Dr. Martinez announced, finally emerging from the surgical area. "We cleaned out the infection and repaired some additional damage we found. The next 24 hours will be critical." She knelt down to Max's level, allowing him to catch Whiskers' scent on her surgical scrubs. The dog's tail gave a slight wag, the first movement he'd made in hours. As they waited for Whiskers to wake from anesthesia, Sarah began the routine paperwork that accompanied any major veterinary procedure. She pulled out Max's preliminary file, planning to update the records with his recent behavior and interactions. But as she began to review the documents, something caught her eye. The microchip scan they'd performed during Max's initial examination had finally returned results. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she read the report. Her breath caught in her throat, and she had to read the information several times to make sure she wasn't mistaking what she was seeing. "Dr. Martinez," she called out, her voice unsteady. "You need to see this." The veterinarian approached, taking the paperwork from Sarah's shaking hands. As she read, her eyes widened. "This can't be," she murmured, but the evidence was right there in black and white. Max had been registered to someone in their town, to Sarah herself, 5 years ago. Memories came flooding back as Sarah stared at the dog who had been watching over Whiskers so faithfully. 5 years ago, she had adopted a puppy, naming him Max, but he had disappeared during a cross-country move. Despite months of searching, putting up posters, and calling shelters across 3 states, she had never found him. "Max?" she whispered, her voice breaking. The dog's ears perked up at the familiar tone, and he turned to look at her fully for the first time since their rescue in the alley. There was recognition in his eyes, not just the trust he'd developed over the past few days, but a deeper knowledge, a memory of a time before he was lost. Sarah fell to her knees beside him, and Max pressed his head against her chest, a gesture so familiar it made her heart ache. All this time, through all the years of separation, He had not only survived, but had maintained the gentle, caring nature she had loved in him as a puppy. "He came back," Dr. Martinez said softly, watching the reunion. "Out of all the places he could have ended up, he found his way back to you." The coincidence seemed almost too perfect to be real, that Max would not only return to his hometown, but would be rescued by his original owner. A small sound from the recovery area drew their attention. Whiskers was waking up, his quiet mews barely audible. Low through the door, Max's head lifted immediately, his focus shifting to his friend's needs despite the emotional reunion taking place. Sarah wiped her eyes and stood up. "Let's go see him together," she said, her voice stronger now. They entered the recovery room as a family. Not just a rescuer and her charges, but a reunited owner and her dog, plus one very special cat who had helped bring them back together. Whiskers lay on his side, still groggy from anesthesia, but his eyes opened as they approached. Max moved forward carefully, touching his nose to his friend's face with infinite gentleness. The cat managed a weak purr, recognizing his protector even through the haze of medication. Sarah watched them together, understanding now why Max's devotion to Whiskers had seemed so extraordinary. Her puppy had always had a gentle soul, always wanted to help and protect others. Even years of living as a stray hadn't changed that fundamental part of his nature. Instead, it had perhaps made him more aware of the need to protect those who were vulnerable. "You're both coming home with me," Sarah announced, her voice thick with emotion. "Both of you." The promise encompassed more than just shelter. It was an offer of family, of belonging, of a permanent end to lonely nights on the streets. Max looked up at her words, his tail wagging with more energy now. He seemed to understand that this wasn't just another temporary shelter, but a return to something he had lost long ago. Yet he didn't move from Whisker's side, making it clear that his commitment to his friend remained unchanged. As the evening settled around them, Sarah pulled up a chair beside the recovery bed. Max lay with his head resting near Whiskers, maintaining his protective vigil even in this safe space. The storm that had brought them together had done more than just force two unlikely animals to seek shelter together. It had set in motion a series of events that would heal old wounds and create new bonds. In that quiet recovery room, watching over her expanded family, Sarah realized that sometimes the greatest acts of love come disguised as coincidence, and that sometimes finding your way home means discovering that home has grown to include new hearts along the way.